Thanks to the entire BITS team for everything you do and for letting me be part of this. It's always fun to just kind of sit and soak up the energy and exciting ideas. You'll notice that, as usual, I'm utterly unqualified for what I'm doing here. Nothing on his list involved ethics, experiments, or surveys. And so the disaster that's about to emerge partly reflects that. But I've been working on ethics for a while, and today I'm going to talk about three things. So I'm going to pay lip service to the first two. I'm just going to sort of deliver my standard line. We're doing a lot more experiments, and there's problems. And the second is, I'm going to pay very little lip service to this, is that we're starting to enter this same debate that bioethicists have been in for a long time. When do you need informed consent? And they've been arguing about this for a long time. And a different approach, which I'm going to propose and report on here, is this idea of empirical ethics. We ought to just ask our subjects and ask each other, try to get a sense of what do we believe about these things, and how do our subjects feel and our principles about the things we're doing. So I'm going to report on a survey I did of political scientists and of citizens, having them read some vignettes and look at some designs and pass judgment on them. So just briefly, as you know, this is data from political science journals. The x-axis is time. The y-axis are a couple different measures of the percentage of experiments being published. It's going up. It's a lot higher for some of the journals. It's over 30% for some of them now. We're doing more experiments, lots more, and this trend continues. We're also doing them in many new places. This is, again, just looking at a small sample of journals, countries over decades where we've done experiments. I would venture a guess that we've done experiments in almost every country on the planet at this point. They just haven't been published yet. And we're doing new kinds of experiments. And so instead of like playing these little games for beer money in the lab, we're out affecting the real world. We're treating 100,000, 200,000 people, and so on. And so the issues that are kind of coming up, there's a number of them, and we had a conference at UCSD. Mike was there, some other people have been there, and we talked about some of them. But two that I'm going to focus on in this survey, the first one of these issues of field experiments. And so they're great. We get out of the lab. We see how the treatment works in the real world, and so on. But on the other hand, we have this like very large body of uninformed and unconsenting subjects. And the second one is this question of local review. So my background is comparative politics. I don't know anybody who's asking permission to do these things overseas. Sometimes they're breaking electoral law in other countries. Sometimes they have corrupt or efficient human rights boards and laws, and no one seems to be complying with them. And we'll talk about these things. There's no clear answers, however, and the field is divided, and you're going to see it's quite divided on some of these questions. So I'm going to lead into the survey by just talking about some of the issues in one kind of field experiment, these informational field experiments, which will be real familiar to you, and then I'll start into some survey results, and I'll spend the bulk of my time actually talking about the data. Okay, so with these informational field experiments, the treatment is some form of information. And so people in the world don't know why they're sort of getting that commercial or this flyer in the mail or whatever, but we're treating them. And it might be that we're sending them a sort of negative ad or a get out the vote message, or we subscribe them to a newspaper. We might be providing them factual information or information of dubious quality. And after some time, we measure an outcome. And maybe it's turnout, and maybe we do a survey, maybe we just observe neighborhood level electoral returns. They've been used all over the world, and you've heard about a couple of controversies involving these. In the US, there was a controversy in Sao Paulo involving the mayoral election some years ago. But they've been applied without detection and without controversy hundreds of times in many different settings. And in most cases, these are legal. They're clearly minimal risk. In many cases, they're normatively defensible, because what's ever wrong with giving citizens more information about politics before they vote, for example, or anything like this? And somehow they seem to make people very angry. And so this is all anecdotal, of course, but sort of after this Facebook study or after this Montana study, if you went to the Montana newspapers and looked at the comments, those Californians are doing this and that, and we need to all saddle up and ride to Palo Alto and take care of them, and so on, so on, so on. And so there was a lot of resentment. There was a lot of resentment of these things. So what do people complain about? So these are some of the issues that I've heard participating in many forums to talk about these field experiments. They might affect election outcomes. That's pretty optimistic, given that campaign consultants haven't figured out how to turn an election on a single flyer, but there's that possibility. They can be deceptive. There's deception in that we don't have these fully informed and consenting people. Their normative value, maybe it's debatable. Maybe instead of trying to provoke turnout or something like that, maybe we should encourage people to spend more time with their kids. Maybe, because we know that voting's a waste of time, right? Similarly, even when we provide factual information and we say that's a good thing, well, maybe we tell people that someone was charged with a crime and we forget to mention that the judicial system in Venezuela was corrupt and that ultimately they were acquitted or never even taken to trial. So a couple other things. These can be really big, right? Treating 100,000 people. Sometimes the political scientists are outspending the actual candidates if these are elections, maybe by as much as 10 to 1 or more. This happens in the US as well. So one of the judicial candidates in Montana spent, I think, $16,000 compared to a couple $100,000 that the researchers had for the study. I don't know exactly what they spent on the treatment. And often it's the case that these experiments are run by outsiders who aren't part of that community. And all these things are things that both scientists and subjects have complained about. And I've made an argument that for many of these, the critical ingredient is informed consent. And if people were fully informed and consenting, then we wouldn't care about size, and we wouldn't care if they learned something in a lab that changed their vote that affected an election. And all of these things, if people were in fact informed and consenting, which leads us, of course, to this question, and I'll just spend a little more time on this before we look at some data. When can you run an experiment without informed consent? And the common rule, says you can do it when there's minimal risk and a few other conditions are met. So these are legal experiments in the United States. Not always, not in some countries, and not according to some ethical documents. But bioethicists spend a lot of time arguing about this. And so there's a recent paper by a Harvard bioethicist about how informed consent is this sort of evil fetish that has infected science, and we need to have committees of citizens deciding who's going to be subjects or not. They actually ran a medical trial without informed consent in ERs in Boston recently. They tried alternative forms of consent and so on. And then there are other people who would say it's never okay to do this. And that's the Nuremberg Declaration and some of the other ethicists. So instead of asking this question, sort of being late to this party, this 40-year-old party arguing about this, maybe we can try this empirical ethics approach. That is, maybe we should just ask our subjects what they think. And this isn't perfect. And so as your mother or father or whatever might have told you at one point, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you too? Or would that make it okay for you to jump off the bridge? And the answer is no, it doesn't. But there's a couple reasons we should at least take this seriously. And at least for those of us at state institutions, these people are both our subjects and our principals. We're spending their tax dollars in our salaries and in our research. Our research funding comes from them. And as our subjects, they deserve some respect. And so ultimately, if they don't like what we're doing, then we ought to be asking whether or not we should be doing it to them. So let me tell you about the surveys. I did 2 surveys last summer. One was to academics, and I sent about 10,000 or so emails. Any subjects in the room? Okay, great. You're all anonymized. But I sent about 10,000 emails to political scientists, got about 1,500 or so respondents, and then I paid for an online panel, and that was just what my budget allowed. And subjects on both sides saw a couple of different vignettes describing an experiment. And so both academics and citizens saw identical informational field experiments. So with a bunch of treatments built into it, it was a survey experiment. I'll tell you about them in a moment. They also saw what I call an interactive field experiment, where we interact with a subject and we pretend to be someone. And so that might be contacting a politician, saying, I'm your constituent, can you please send me information about this? Or it might be contacting a business and, sort of, or submitting a resume, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The local review question, I actually see it as mostly critical for scholars to deal with first, but I asked a version of it to citizens, and then just for comparison, and I won't show it unless I'm done really early, I asked some questions about deception in classical lab experiments with not unexpected results. So let me tell you about the first of the vignettes. It was an informational field experiment. So the researchers were sending a flyer to, and I'll show you the text in a moment. And there are a couple of treatments built in there. So the main one is deception. So are people fully informed and consenting, or are they unaware that they're subjects? The second one, what's the message? And I tried to vary messages from sort of highly normative to maybe sort of questionable. So one of them was just a reminder to floss. And one of them was a reminder to vote, a get out the vote message. And one of them was a reminder that a candidate had gotten a DUI. Factual information. I varied the size, I varied the source of the mailer, so some of them were anonymous, some of them came from fake groups, and then could this affect an election outcome? That one obviously did not apply to the flossing experiment. Okay, so here's one example. Professor J, anything in red was randomly varied. Professor J wants to see if a flyer has an effect on, in this case, whether people vote. Could have been on who people vote for, or dental health habits. During an election, Professor J chooses 100,000 people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Flyers sent anonymously or from a fake group. And then I measure my treatment in this vignette through a survey, not through actual turnout. The reason I did that is because I wanted to make this as comparable as possible to the non-deception version. Because the non-deception version says, so-and-so recruits the same number of people and says, I'm going to send you some mail, you're going to be part of this experience. So it's kind of like a field experiment, except they've opted in, and the flyer comes saying, this is from Professor J, so on and so on and so on. So making those comparable was actually a challenge, sort of informed and uninformed, making them as comparable as possible. And it makes the script a little bit awkward in a few places. Two dependent variables. So I'm not an expert on survey questions, so unfortunately, don't have me help you write yours, because I did mine. I'm going to get hammered on this, but that's all right. To what extent do you agree that it is acceptable to conduct this study? To all you political scientists who wrote what was wrong with that question in the comments part of the survey, thank you very much. And that went from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then after the trial rollout for the citizens, I added this question, because it struck me that for a citizen, we're both interested in their judgment in the abstract of the experiment, as well as in their judgment of how they feel about being part of it. So I asked them this question separately. Suppose you'd learned this study like this one had been conducted in your community and you were one of the subjects. How would you feel about it? So here's the sort of basic results. So the x-axis here is floss, DUI, floss, get out the vote, and DUI. The y-axis is the agreement score from 1 to 7. Again, high means we agree it's acceptable. Low means we strongly disagree it's acceptable. The left panel is faculty. The right panel is citizens. And the dark line is attitudes about an informed consent experiment. And the dotted line is the deceptive experiment. Is this acceptable? And so a couple things to note. First is that neither scholars nor our subjects particularly like deception, generally. So you'll notice that, quote unquote, agreement that it's acceptable is always lower. You'll also notice that academics are much more responsive to the treatments, and that holds sort of throughout this study for reasons that we could kind of all anticipate. Also, these are people who self-selected in versus people who were part of a paid online panel. And you'll note that at least for the academics, they complied with my pre-registered hypotheses, flossing first, then get out the vote, then DUI. One of my citizen subjects wrote about their terrible dental experiences in the comments section, which I think something about private citizens, they resent flossing and dental health. And so they did not like that treatment. You'll notice there's a spike for get out the vote. So just throwing these into a regression so you can see the other variables. Everything holds for the deception, get out the vote, and DUI. Excluded category here is flossing. You'll notice they don't like fake groups. right? So neither academics nor citizens like fake groups. Size doesn't matter. They actually don't care if it's 1,000 people or 100,000 people. Some people actually wrote about size in the comments, but it doesn't show up in the data. Close election, not significant for citizens, significant for political scientists. So we apparently are more concerned about this, though again, there's questions about comparability. Then here's the last question. How would you feel had you learned that you'd been in this study? And again, the dashed line. And so the y-axis now is the proportion who would have rather not been in it. So big here is bad. And so about 20 to 30% in the philosophy and get out the vote would rather not have been in it. About 50% of the subjects who were in the DUI deceptive experiment would rather not have been in there. And that's actually, I think that's a sort of pretty striking. I could explain away the first two as people were sort of doing this randomly. The last one says to me, I mean, it says that if you're running a negative ad experiment, maybe half your subjects didn't want to be in it or were coerced into it. And that's something to think about. Let me show you the interactive field experiment. So in this one, the PI is sending an email to some target audience. And you've probably all been subjects. I know I have. I believe I have. You get those emails from that sort of grad student eagerly wanting something, and then 2 weeks later they say, remember that email? So anyway, these things happen all the time. Ask for information, manipulate features of the request, and so on. So treatments here are, again, deception, informed consent or no informed consent. Who's the target? So elected officials. By the way, it's completely legal to do this, and we're allowed to do this under the common rule. We have an exemption for doing this kind of research. Businesses or home sellers, somebody who's trying to sell a home. That's, by the way, why I asked you if you've ever owned a home. A lot of people wanted to know why I wanted to know about that. I varied the size again. The topic, I varied it from something more normative to something less normative. Are you interested in political or public communication, or are you interested in discrimination in communication? And then how much time did it take the target to respond, and were they debriefed or not? Here's an example. Professor J wants to study public communication, so this is not the discrimination one. They send an email. They pretend to be someone who lives in the district. They ask for information. They vary something about the request. It takes them 60 minutes to respond, and then they'll find out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if some questions are more likely to get answered than others. And in this case, there was no debriefing. So here's the main results. The x-axis here is the target audience. So it starts with politicians, then businesses, then homeowners. The y-axis is, again, the agreement score, and the dotted line here is, again, the deceptive. So you'll notice, again, there's general distaste for deception. Academics are much more responsive than citizens. I actually expected more of a reaction to private citizens here. The idea of sort of, if you ever sold your home, you know it's a kind of stressful time. If someone's emailing you and pretending to be a home buyer and it takes you an hour to respond, I thought that would make people upset. It didn't so much. I also expected, at least academics, to be most in agreement with doing this with politicians because that's legal. But there was not sort of strong reaction to it, again, from the citizens. Inter-aggression, again, size doesn't matter. Discrimination does. So if you're studying something that's considered normatively valuable, there's much more generosity in terms of agreement. Burden on subjects, they don't like something that takes an hour. They don't mind so much something that takes 5 minutes. Debriefing didn't matter. So we may debrief to comply with IRB and make our IRB happy. Doesn't affect the subjects, doesn't affect the way our colleagues judge our study. And that debrief included an option to have your data deleted from the study. Would you rather not have been involved? Slightly different question, again, only asking citizens. Y-axis is the proportion who would rather not have been in the study. In this case, there's more response, and you'll notice that these citizens, a significant percentage, maybe 40%, would have rather not been in the study had they been a home buyer or home seller in a deceptive study. So I'll show you we're doing reasonably well on time, so I'll show you the local review questions, and we may have time for a little bit of the additional data before I wrap up. So the local review question, as someone who works on comparative politics, this is actually really important to us, and it's an evolving question. So it's actually in some ways easiest maybe in a place like sort of China or Cuba, because you're just not going to get approval to do a study. And there is a really expensive way to do it in China, but a lot of the people working on Chinese politics don't have any governmental approval to do experiments there. They just go and do it, many of them. It's also easy in a place, say, like Mexico, where there's no formal procedure for IRB for foreigners. And if you want approval, you'll basically just ask somebody at CDA or one of the other good universities, and maybe they have a little committee that'll approve it like that. And so it's easy. The hard cases for me are the cases like Brazil, where I've done most of my research, where I went through that process, and it took 2 years to get a partial approval for a survey experiment in a democracy with sort of very safe questions. And so that was really difficult. And so most scholars, I don't know of anyone else who's actually gone through that procedure. On the other hand, when you do this, there's risks to diplomacy. There's all sorts of potential problems for future research. So academics saw the following vignette. Is it okay to go ahead and run the study? And what I varied here was regime type, democracy or not, how long the review would take, and whether or not it was risky. So here's one version of the script. In this case, Professor J was always based in the US. In this case, the review process is difficult to navigate. Although it's a democracy, some of the questions were sensitive. So this was one of the high-risk vignettes. And there's two or three striking things here. The first is core hypotheses are as expected. The dashed line, the dotted line here is for democracies. So there's more tolerance for skipping the review process and doing these kind of covert ops experiments in authoritarian regimes, which makes complete sense to me. And the x-axis here is how long would the review process take. And there's also, as the time approaches infinity, support goes up. The thing that was actually a real surprise to me is how low approval was here. And maybe it's because I spend all my time with people that work on comparative politics, but for the rest of our colleagues, the idea of doing an experiment in one of these places without approval was horrifying. There were sort of lots of comments written about, don't break the law. It's as simple as that. And so, at least among the discipline, or among other members of the academy, there's opposition to what many scholars are doing right now. For citizens, I asked a slightly different question, and I had originally intended to do this in Mexico as well as the US. I only wound up doing it in the US, but I varied how long it would take, and I varied whether or not the scholar was in the US or Mexico and was doing the research in US or Mexico. And so here's the results we got on that. So a US scholar in Mexico, a US scholar operating in the US, a Mexican scholar operated in the US. And what you see is there's a sort of slightly more tolerance for quote unquote misbehavior in your own country. You'll note that the US scholar overseas and the Mexican scholar in the US, there's less approval. Effects aren't large, and they don't care much about time. The two different lines here represent two different time periods. So I'll show you the key findings, and depending on how many questions there are, I'll show you a little bit of additional data. So clearly, academics and subjects don't like deception, and they don't like being lied to. Fake group was significant. Deception was always significant. And for at least one version of one of these simple field experiments, perhaps half of your subjects don't actually want to be there, and you've effectively coerced them into participating in your study. Let's note that scholars and subjects are responsive to the normative value of our studies, and they pick that up in these little vignettes. So sort of get out the vote was always better than the DUI message. If maybe you think the DUI message is more normatively valuable, but at least I personally didn't. And in the other vignette, discrimination got a lot more approval than just plain old communication. And there's little support for international research without local approval, which I think is going to have a big effect on comparative politics. Let's note that there's a lot of things not to like about this, and there's a lot of things, there's a lot of constraints and limitations on this. And so there's lots of reasons why this might not generalize. It might be that sort of people in Brazil would be delighted to get a flyer that says so-and-so got a DUI, because there's no negative campaigning there. And because of the structure of the electoral market, neither the media nor the other candidates provide negative information ever. And they might actually consider that really valuable information in some contexts. Clearly, citizens are responding more haphazardly. They may be sort of doing this randomly, and so point estimates deserve some caution before you sort of take them to the bank. Both from citizens and from scholars, like a common phrase was, a horrible research design, but it's ethical or it's not. And so the scholars were very critical of the research side. The subjects were too. They'd say, this is stupid, why would anyone do research like this? And sometimes they might have been right. And scholars sometimes made the observation, this might be ethical, but it's not ethical because it's sort of a bad design and a waste of money. Okay. If I were to, two next steps that I would take with this reflect this next point. I think it would be really interesting to have a real conversation with a voter about, or a subject about one of these things, and talk to them and say, this is why I did this. We did this to mitigate risk. All I did was send you a flyer. Is this okay? And I'd like to think that if we did that people would be less or would be more accepting of this kind of research. Questions could be better written, et cetera, et cetera. But with all these flaws, I think we need to take these results seriously, because they're all we know right now, which suggests a couple things. I mean, it suggests, this is sort of, I think, a general theme in all this, is we can minimize problems by using informed consent whenever you possibly can, or using a third-party intervention where someone else is doing it and you're just along for the ride. If you're using one of these deceptive field experiments, in other work I've argued there's 4 things you need to do. You need to try to do good. That means do something that's normatively valuable. Tread lightly, so don't have a big footprint. Confess and debrief. And if you can, you should compensate your subjects. I think we actually need more research on these questions, and we need to talk to voters and subjects in other countries, as well as sort of whenever you're doing a study here in the US, try debriefing some of your subjects and ask them about the ethics of it. And for comparative politics, I think there's trouble coming on this overseas approval part. I think we're going to have to be very careful about that. So that's all I have for today. I have a couple of data slides or not. Thanks.